Hello, today I'm looking at Majjhima number 137, and that's called the SalayatanaVibhanga Sutta, which is translated as the exposition of the sixfold base or six sense organs. Now, with this one, I'm referencing the Pali Canon translations by Bhikkhu Bodhi and Thanissaro, and normally I mainly rely on the Bodhi translation, but in this case I've sort of flip-flopped between the Thanissaro translation and the Bodhi translation because of the different wordings they've used, and some make more sense to me than others in both of those. So it's an amalgam of the two translations, I suppose. Now the location is Savatthi in the Jetter's Grove at Anathapindika's Park, and the persons mentioned are Buddha, or the Blessed One, and the assembly of monks or bhikkhus. Now it starts with Buddha addressing the monks, saying he will teach them the analysis of the six sense realms. So he starts with, the following should be understood and known. 1. The six internal bases. 2. The six external bases. 3. The six classes of consciousness. 4. The six classes of contact. 5. The 18 kinds of mental exploration. And 6. The 36 emotions to which beings are attached, and with regard to them, by depending on this, abandon that. There are 3 foundations of mindfulness that a noble one cultivates. Once cultivated, he is a teacher fit to instruct a group. So I've actually, I'm going to split this into 2 video sessions, and the second video session will cover the teaching aspect. So to continue, among the teachers of the training, it is he that is called the incomparable leader of persons to be trained, and I've covered that in the second part. This is a summary of the exposition of the sixfold base. So it goes on. The 6 internal bases should be understood. The eye base, the ear base, the nose base, the tongue base, the body base, and the mind base. Then the 6 external bases. The form base, the sound base, the odor base, the flavor base, the tangible or touch base, and the mind object or thought base. So that's what we can experience. And next goes on to the 6 classes. The 6 classes of consciousness should be understood. So there's the eye consciousness, the ear consciousness, the nose consciousness, the tongue consciousness, the body consciousness, and the mind consciousness. So the note I've got there is that's how we are adapted to be aware of external experiences, or how we are to be mentally adapted to be aware of external experiences. The 6 classes of contact should be understood. So that's eye contact, ear contact, nose contact, tongue contact, body contact, and mind contact. So that's how we are physically adapted. And then there's the 18 kinds of mental exploration that should be understood. So on seeing a form with the eye, one explores a form that can act as the basis for happiness, or that can act as a basis for sadness, or act as a basis for equanimity. So that's happiness, sadness, and equanimity. So too, on hearing a sound with the ear, or smelling an aroma with the nose, on tasting a flavour with the tongue, on touching an object with the body, on thinking with the mind. Each of these can act as a provocation for happiness, for grief, or for equanimity. So the 18 instances refers to the 6 sense perceptions and the 3 different reactions. And the next one is the 36 emotions to which beings are attached should be known. So each of the following have 6 emotions or positions. So there's the 6 of joy of the household life, the 6 emotions of the joy of renunciation, or being a renunciant, the 6 of grief of the household life, the 6 of grief of renunciation, the 6 of equanimity of the household life, and the 6 of equanimity of renunciation. So the 6 emotions is these: hear, smell, sense, taste, so forth, and then there's joy, grief, equanimity, as previously said, and then that's further split into household life and renunciation. So renunciation, a recluse or renunciant. So the 6 joys of household life: the happiness that arises when one regards as an acquisition the acquisition of forms recognized by the eye, agreeable, pleasing, charming, endearing, connected with worldliness, or when one recalls the previous acquisition of such forms after they have passed, ceased, and changed. This is the joy of household life. And then that repeats for sounds, experience, smells, taste, touch, and thoughts. And the 6 kinds of joy of renunciation: this, when by knowing the impermanence, change, fading away, and cessation of forms, one sees as it actually is with proper wisdom, that forms, both formerly and now, are all impermanent, suffering and subject to change, joy arises. This is called joy based upon renunciation. And then this repeats again for perceived sounds, smells, tastes, touch, and thoughts. So that's their impermanence. And the 6 kinds of grief of the household life: when one regards as a non-acquisition the non-acquisition of forms cognizable by the eye, those that are wished for, desired, agreeable, gratifying, and associated with worldliness, or when one recalls what was previously not obtained, that has passed, ceased, changed, grief arises. Such grief is the grief based on household life. So again, this repeats with sound, smells, taste, touch, and thoughts. And what are the 6 kinds of grief based on renunciation? When, by knowing the impermanence, change, fading away, and cessation of forms, one sees it as it actually is with proper wisdom, that forms both before and now are all impermanent, suffering and subject to change. One generates a longing for supreme liberation. Thus, when shall I enter upon and abide in that state that the noble ones now enter upon and abide in? Such grief as this is called grief based upon renunciation. Similarly, by knowing the impermanence, change, fading away, and cessation of sounds, odours, tastes, objects, mind objects, one generates a longing for the supreme liberation. In one who thus generates a longing for the supreme liberation, grief arises, with that longing as a condition. Such grief as this is called grief based on renunciation. Those are the 6 kinds of grief-based renunciation. So yeah, that covers sounds, taste, and so on and so forth. So yeah, although one overcomes longing for these things because they seem to be impermanent, there still remains the longing for supreme liberation, which gives a rise to grief. And the next it goes on, and what are the 6 kinds of equanimity based on the household life? The equanimity that arises when a foolish, deluded, untaught person who is blind to danger sees a form with the eye, and the equanimity does not go beyond the form, which is why it is called equanimity based on household life. So the way I've understood that is an untaught person displays equanimity or calmness because, for example, they do not recognize the danger or the reward. So like a person comes across a poisonous snake for the first time, doesn't realize the danger involved, so they can display equanimity, if you like, due to ignorance, or say being given a painting by Picasso and wondering what, having no reaction to it. So the note I've got, so although it's described, it's seen as equanimity, it may be just unawareness. Now again, this equanimity of the household life repeats for the other senses: sound, odours, flavours, touch, mind objects. It goes on, and what are the 6 kinds of equanimity based on renunciation? When, by knowing the impermanence, change, fading away, and cessation of forms, one sees it as it actually is, with proper wisdom, that forms, both before and now, are all impermanent, suffering, and subject to change, then equanimity arises. So such equanimity as this transcends the form. This is why it is called equanimity based on renunciation. So the same applies to knowing the impermanence, change, fading away of sounds, odours, flavours, touch, and mind objects. These are the 6 kinds of equanimity based on renunciation. So it is with reference to this that it was said, the 36 positions should be understood. So equanimity is, because it's or renunciation, the realization that it's sort of impermanence and always subject to change. Why bother getting upset about it all? Because it will just pass on. So it goes on. Therein, by depending on by depending on this, abandon that. So it was said, and with what reference was this said? Here, monks, by depending and relying on the 6 kinds of joy based on renunciation, abandon and surmount the 6 kinds of joy based on the household life. It is thus they are abandoned and surmounted. By depending and relying on the 6 kinds of grief based on renunciation, enable the abandonment and surmounting of the 6 kinds of grief based on the household life. It is thus they are abandoned and surmounted. By depending and relying on the 6 kinds of equanimity based on renunciation, abandon and surmount the 6 kinds of equanimity based on the household life. It is thus they are abandoned and surmounted. So the note I've got here, so it would seem the teaching is perceive everything as impermanent, subject to change, fading away, and ceasing. So this is the way to complete equanimity. And then it goes on, by depending and relying on the 6 kinds of joy based on renunciation, abandon and surmount the 6 kinds of grief based on renunciation. It is thus they are abandoned. That is, joy transcends grief in its renunciant view, in the renunciant view or methodology. And then, by depending and relying upon the 6 kinds of equanimity based on renunciation, abandon and surmount the 6 kinds of joy based on renunciation. It is thus they are abandoned, it is thus they are surmounted. So don't think of the negative, think of the positive, I suppose. And suggested the correct state is equanimity, which is a steady state rather than joy and grief. There is, monks, equanimity that is diversified. So it goes on about equanimity. There is, monks, equanimity that is diversified based on diversity, and there is equanimity that is unified based on unity. The equanimity based on diversity is the equanimity regarding forms, sounds, odours, flavours and touch, i.e. the sense organs. The equanimity that is unified based on unity is the equanimity regarding the base of infinite space, the base of infinite consciousness, the base of nothingness, and the base of neither perception nor non-perception. So that's the jhana meditative states. Here, monks, by depending and relying on equanimity that is unified, based on unity, abandon and surmount equanimity that is diversified, based on diversity. It is thus this is abandoned. It is thus this is surmounted. Monks, by depending and relying on non-identification, abandon and surmount equanimity that is unified, based on unity. It is thus this is abandoned, and it is thus this is surmounted. So I'll again put down a note here. The word translated as non-identification in the Bodhi version, or it's called non-fashioning in the Thanissaro version. The original word in Pali is atamayata, which literally translates as there is no that. Which could perhaps be translated as inconsequential or perhaps non-consequential. So it's the opposite of if this then that, IFTTT. It is just this. Buddha continues, so it was in reference to this that it was said, therein, depending on this, abandon that. So that's the end of the first part of the sutta. Now I'll sort of summarise the steps, or how I understand the steps go through in the development of progression of sensory development. So it starts off with a definition of the senses. So the sutta starts off with the definition of the senses, which then elaborates or goes to as experienced by a householder. Then it goes to as experienced by a renunciant or recluse. And then it becomes an explanation of grief. And then explanation the grief can become joy. And then the joy becomes diversified equanimity via the 6 senses. And then the diversified equanimity becomes unified equanimity via meditation. And then that ends up as atamayata, or non-identification, or non-fashioning, or there is no that. And that's how I see this sutta progressing through the stages. And I've also noted from doing a bit of research on the internet, another definition of this term atamayata is the quality of awareness without a subject-object duality. So everything else is, you see something, there's something to be seen, you see it, you then interpret it with a beginning, a middle, and end. And what this is saying is, so that's the subject-object duality. But in fact, what it's saying in the atamayata, you see something, stop. So there's no duality. There's no progression from subject to object. There's just subject or just object. Anyway, thanks for watching. Then I'll be part 2.